Now, on to our topic today. The African Tech Startups Funding Report by Disrupt Africa has revealed that Kenyan tech startups received 71.7 billion shillings, that is $574.8 million in 2022, a figure that is almost double 2021's 36.4 billion shillings, which equates to $292 million. The country's average investment size also went up from 424.3 million shillings, that is $3.4 million in 2021, to 786.2 million shillings, that is $6.3 million in 2022. And now I'm joined by Andrew Fastnages, the founder and director of Africa Tech Summit. Andrew, welcome to the show. Just looking at, first of all, the startup ecosystem. We are starting the new year. I know it's February. You're preparing for Valentine's. But before we talk Valentine's, the startup ecosystem for the year 2022, what were the trends? What really shaped startup in Africa?
I think 2022 was slightly a crazy year for startups across Africa. I think funding rounds were oversubscribed in many cases. I think with COVID and the advent of Zoom, what we saw last year was that funding rounds were being closed by syndicates on calls, very little due diligence in some deals, and valuations went a bit crazy. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're seeing now, moving into 2023, is a bit more of a realization that the fundamentals need to be there.
Definitely, because for looking at some of the promising startups that I just mentioned while we were starting the show, I mean, everyone was like, the growth rate. Sometimes people read a disconnect. You're growing too fast, or what might be the problem for such scenarios, those 6 startups? What might have happened for them to sort of close shop?
I think, startups and funding is great, but we need to go back to the customer. What's the startup doing? And what is the affordable income of that customer? And if we look now across Africa and globally, we're seeing inflation crazy. We're seeing people's disposable income reducing. This impacts those types of businesses. So for startups that closed up, look, I think, valuation is one thing and investment is one thing, but is the product or is the service viable? And I think what we're seeing now in investing across the continent is a flight to safety in terms of investors are focusing on businesses that are revenue generating, have traction, as opposed to an idea.
Definitely. And Africa is the youngest continent in the world. When we talk market projections, it's very promising. And that sort of has been used as a narrative for foundations when it comes to having a ready market in Africa. Is that the reality on the ground, or those sound fundamentals that you talk about are even more critical when you're operating a startup on this continent?
Yeah, I think, if you look at people coming into Africa who are not Africans, they'll look at Africa, as an opportunity. But as you know, Kenya is fundamentally very different than Tanzania, than Rwanda, than Nigeria. So each market's got its own fundamentals. And to launch a service in Kenya and even expand it into Nigeria, completely different set of regulations. If it's a financial services, different regulators. If it's a telecoms, you got different regulators. So it's not easy to just cut and paste a startup across the whole of Africa. But the fundamentals are, if the product works, then there's good potential. I think, compared to, say, US ecosystems and European ecosystems, where they will go for blitz scaling and try and invest millions and millions of dollars just to take the market and see where the revenue comes. If you look at Uber, Uber didn't make profit for a number of years. I think the African market's slightly different.
Definitely. And looking at that particular report, very promising. Looking at the 2021 numbers and 2022, almost doubling.
Yeah.
Amidst an environment we call, a recovering environment from the impact from COVID. 2023, are we going to see a doubling of the 2022 numbers, or we might have sort of a reset?
I don't think we'll see a doubling this year, personally. I think we are seeing a global pullback with inflation, as we see big tech is pulling back and investing. I think African investors are well capitalized. A lot of funds have raised big funds in the last number of years that still needs to be deployed. But I think the fundamentals, as I said last year, went a little bit crazy in terms of valuations and deals. I think the pendulum has swung probably back to the investor for 2023. They can pick and choose now. I heard recently the other day from another investor, you know, Africa was awash last year with Silicon Valley investors and other investors from Europe. Silicon Valley is going through a bit of a retrenchment process now where investors are pulling back on deals. So that capital that was maybe allocated for here might start to pull back. So I think we're going to see a slightly tougher market maybe in 2023. That said, I still think there's some great companies. There's a lot of great investors. I think we have a lot of African investors now as well. So if we look at what's happened with startups, for example, like Paystack, Flutterwave, Cellulent, those guys have created an environment now where a lot of the guys who worked in those companies have gone to start their own businesses. So I think we've progressed a huge amount. And also in terms of some of these founders are now investing in the next generation.
Okay.
Whereas I think if we talk 6, 7, 8 years ago, there wasn't many people investing in startups.
Definitely.
And I think on the syndicate level, we're seeing syndicates where people are putting in smaller check sizes into a syndicate and investing in startups. So I think the future is still very bright. I think we needed a sense of reality this year as well. Certainly at Africa Tech Summit, which is coming up, I think we're seeing huge, exciting, innovative companies.
Definitely. And 14 of them, you give them an opportunity to pitch live and sell. You say, you know, bottom line is the issue of product. The market itself, is it solving the problem? And can you be able to sell to Noah, to Andrew? For this year, I mean, the Tech Summit is coming up next week. I've seen 14 startups pitching. All of them. Are we getting all of them? Will they get some form of funding from this pitch, or are you picking top 3?
Well, no. So, I mean, how Pitch Live works at Africa Tech Summit, we've put a call to action out across Africa. We had over, I think, 300 entries from across the continent. And unfortunately, we have to boil that down to a small cohort of startups who pitch. The ones that pitch sometimes are not always looking for funding. Some are looking for partnerships. Some are looking for exposure. The good thing is, I would say, about Africa Tech Summit next week is that we have a lot of investors coming from across the continent. So both from seed all the way up to, you know, Series A and the likes of IFC and bigger multinational investors.
Definitely.
Will they get funding? Let me put it to you another way. Last year, we had a startup who came to the pre-event on the evening before the event. She met an investor and she wrote her a check. Now, I was amazed that someone still carries a checkbook. But there you go. So there are good possibilities. We also put together a deal book for all companies coming, so they can submit their deal, and we give that to investors before the event. So I think the important bit is being there, speaking to people, and connecting with people, and that's what Africa Tech Summit is really about: is connecting investors, startups, corporates, government, policymakers.
Okay. So you say you open up, you know, this forum, people to apply, and you scale down from 250 to 14.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's very tough, first of all. And secondly, also, is there some sort of pattern, trend where we are seeing, you know, startups moving towards? I know fintech has been a huge one post-COVID. What trends are we seeing and expecting in 2023? Yeah,
good point. I think certainly as an event, Africa Tech Summit, we really felt also we need to showcase what's happening with challenges that are happening. So if we look at climate, it's a big challenge for everybody. So we've got some exciting startups who are doing stuff in agriculture, in food technology, and different climate. We've a great startup coming from Morocco who are transforming desert into agricultural land. You know, so I think some of those are exciting. And if we look at from an investment standpoint, a lot of investors and funds and LPs of funds now have much more of a climate focus. So they're actually saying we need to invest in climate. Within the event as well, we'll have an electronic vehicle showcase. Again, important because these are technology solutions which are solving some of the climate issues that we have.
Definitely. I'm looking at the way some of the global leaders, when it comes to companies that started as startups and dominating Silicon Valley as we talk right now, they managed to go global. One of the discussions that you're having in the country is the issue of the public being able to buy into some of these ideas. Yeah, we have seen very little listing in our securities exchange here. Is startup, an area that we can tap into and sort of redirect and raise funding on our NSE?
Yes, I think it's a big opportunity. I think if we look also what's happening with blockchain and Web3, there's a number of companies coming up with kind of fractional ownership. So, for example, Tesla share might be $500. Not everybody has $500, but they might have $100, and they want to invest $100. So, fractional share ownership, I think, is a big thing. Also, in terms of capital and secondary listings, so say a startup has made a couple of rounds, their valuation has gone up, but the founders are still locked in with their shares. But I think we're going to see a lot more of secondary share trading happening, where founders can sell their shares in secondary markets, which is happening in other markets. In terms of the Kenyan stock market, I think there's an opportunity. I think, sometimes it's the capital requirements and the regulation and the policy needs to change so smaller ventures can come onto the markets and raise capital.
Definitely.
Our London event is held at London Stock Exchange, and they're actively working to try and encourage African companies to come and list on the London Stock Exchange as well.
Okay. You've touched on Kenya. You've touched on a startup. Is it in Morocco?
Yeah.
That's doing something on Martyrs Food. I know when you talk about startups and especially tech startups, Nigeria is always in the equation. South Africa is always in the equation. How much activity are we seeing from these countries?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Kenya is a strong ecosystem, very strong. But in terms of Africa Tech Summit, last year we brought in delegates from 46 countries. This year I think will be more. Of those, Kenya represented probably 40% of delegates, and then the rest, Nigeria is very strong. Egypt is also a very, very strong ecosystem. South Africa. But we are seeing some other exciting markets, things happening. Things are beginning to happen in DRC. A very, very undiscovered market for a lot of companies. Some of the Francophone markets as well, Ghana as well. But, if you look at Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal in terms of Francophone, a lot of the times they don't get as much attention as the Anglophone markets. So I think tech across the continent is really exciting. I think if we look at what's happening across the continent in terms of investor syndicates and angel networks, that's really helping. It all comes down to funding, number one.
Yes.
A startup needs to be funded. Once they have a funding, then they can go and build.
Definitely. I know the summit is coming up next week. Somebody has a startup. Maybe they were part of the 250, but they were scaled out. They didn't see their name amongst the 14. In terms of participation, is it open, free fall? Can we all of us come and show up with my startup?
Unfortunately, it's not that easy. I think we have capacity limits at the venue. The event sold out last year, and it's looking like we're heading that way as well. It is a business event, so we try and match people and bring relevant people that they match the right people there. So we have investors meeting startups, corporates meeting different people. But anybody can still register online at africatechsummit.com/Nairobi. We have tried to help as many people to come as we can. We also... Developers are another key component. We talk about startups and investors, but if you don't have developers, a lot of the time you can't build these tech businesses.
Definitely.
And certainly within the Web3 and the crypto space, there is a huge opportunity for tech talent in Kenya to develop Web3 skills, to work with the likes of Celo, Polygon, Ethereum, and protocols who are building the next generation of the web on Web3.
Yeah.
So I think there's huge opportunity for young tech talent watching this now to get involved.
I know, the issue with Bitcoin that happened recently last year, a better part of it, and some Brankfied, all that drama, sort of everyone's like, we're telling you about this tech and regulation around it. I don't know, as we part regulation in Africa, briefly touching on tech regulation in Africa, what do you think? Do we need to make moves on that?
Yeah, look, I think within the crypto space, you know, regulation is definitely required, and I think some of the crypto and Web3 people are very open to it. I think the issue is globally is that no one has come up with a framework. We also run the Africa Money and DeFi Summit, which is part of our Africa Tech Summit next week, but we hosted one in West Africa in Ghana. And what I was really impressed by was the Ghanaian regulator openly, you know, coming to discuss this with Web3 companies, and they're building a framework for cryptocurrencies and maybe central bank digital currencies in Ghana. So I think the policy thing really has to move on. I think companies are open to being regulated if they know that they can get the service and they can provide services.
All right.
I think the issue right now is globally, and we look at FTX, what happened. The regulation piece wasn't there, and people are working in and outside of what they think a framework is. Until a framework's in place, it's difficult.
Definitely, and I'm glad you're making progress in that. Andrew, this has been a good chat. I appreciate Andrew Fastnage, founder and director, Africa Tech Summit, saying that, you know, the African tech startup ecosystem is vibrant. 2023, we might experience a little bit of a reset here and there, but it's good for the sector. At the same time, there's funding. People are hungry to put their money into promising startups, and it boils down to the consumer. Are you solving the problem of the consumer? That is the latest from the world of startups. We take a short break right here on Business Today. We'll return with more. Stay tuned.